we are back to the DaniPod. Today we have Dr. Patrick Moore, a fighter, a truth seeker. Welcome to the DaniCast. How are you? It's a pleasure to have you here. You are on our top list to be here.
I'm very well. I'm very well today, Daniel, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
I thank you a lot. You know, Dr. Moore, we need to hear your story, your knowledge, your common sense to understand what is going on our planet right now. I want to talk about your new book, which I have right here with me, and Amazon, Brazil, since you have been here. First of all, I would like to hear from you. Who is Dr. Patrick Moore? Give us a little bit of your background. Where were you born? What did you study?
Well, I was born on Vancouver Island and I live here today. But where I was born is about 5.5 hours driving north from here at the very end of the northern road to the Pacific, called Winter Harbor. And Winter Harbor, at the time I was born, had no road. Only boats could come there from the ocean. Yeah. So it was a very remote place, and my village was floating on logs. Wow. Of about 60 people, my father's logging camp. This village was able to move from one place to another on the ocean, but in a protected area, in an inlet, as we call it, or a bay. And so that's how I grew up, living on a floating village.
Oh, that's amazing.
It wasn't until I was a teenager, when I was 15 or 16, a road came. And then we thought, oh my goodness, there's only 120 people here altogether between the fishing people and the forestry people.
Yeah.
And we thought, now this place will grow. Half the people used the road to get out. So we learned something of human nature that day. But now it's coming alive again. It's had 2 or 3 renaissance, and now there are maybe 100 people in the summer are there. So it's a very small, tiny, isolated village way in the north of Vancouver Island. So where I live in Comox, and the view you see behind me is the view from my house. Beautiful. This is the Quinish Glacier. This glacier has been there for at least 100,000 years. So it may melt if the warming gets a little more, but it may not, because it has been there a long time. It's at about less than 3,000 meters, 2,500 meters. So that's my mountain out there. I went to school in a boat until I was grade 8. Oh. And then there was no more school for me. It was only one room school with grade 1 to 8. Yeah. Maybe 12, 13 of us, different every year, but never more than this. And then I was sent to boarding school in Vancouver, to a private school. Yeah. My parents were able to afford this, thankfully, even living in such a remote place doing forestry. And I excelled in life science, in biology and chemistry also. And then I went to the University of British Columbia, where I obtained a Bachelor of Science honors in biology and life science.
Yes.
Genetics and biochemistry and physiology and these subjects. And then I heard about the science of ecology. At this time, the word ecology in the late 1960s had never been in the public media. No one knew this word except for scientists, a few scientists in universities. But I realized that ecology was what I wanted to do, because it means studying the interrelationships among all the aspects of the environment on this earth, between the soil and the sky, the atmosphere, the oceans, the rocks, and all living things. So ecology is virtually infinite in its interrelationships. And just like the climate is extremely complex with many factors and very difficult to predict, impossible, in fact. We could talk about that later, because people are always trying to predict.
We will, yeah.
But yes, but these are foolish efforts. Although sometimes people get lucky by chance.
So,
Most predictions that come true are actually ones that are lucky by chance, I believe. But I went into ecology and never looked back. But as soon as I came into ecology, I realized that I wanted to play a part, not only to study books, but to become part of the change that was needed to protect the environment.
to make something.
From pollution. And what I learned, a small group of people was meeting in a church basement in Vancouver. Greenpeace began in Vancouver, Canada. And
So you were in the beginning of the Greenpeace. You were one of the co-founders, we could say.
I was one of the co-founders. In fact, Greenpeace recognized me as a co-founder on Greenpeace International website until 2007, which was 30 years after I left Greenpeace. They still had my name as one of the founders. But when I came out in favor of nuclear energy in those years, they took my name away. So now they say I was not a co-founder, which is what we call in English historical revisionism. In other words, changing the past.
It is happening a lot in these days.
Yes, it is. And of course, you can't change the past, but you can pretend that you have changed the past. And so that's what they have done. But never mind that. I was in the first group of people, spent 6 months planning a protest voyage in a small fishing boat from Vancouver to Alaska, which is across the North Pacific Ocean, a very treacherous piece of water. And in a small fishing boat, 12 of us plus our captain, which we hired this boat, was not our boat. So we had to find a captain who would take us on this voyage. We went against US hydrogen bomb testing in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. And at this time was the very height of the Cold War and the escalation of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union, as Russia was called then.
It was in the 70s or 60s?
1971. 1971 was the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the Cold War, the scariest time for the threat of nuclear war actually happening between the United States and Russia.
And that's about the border of the US with Russia, right? Where you were going, right?
Close, yes. About halfway out the Aleutian Islands towards Japan and Russia. So the United States was testing these hydrogen bombs underground because by this time, the United States, Russia, England had agreed to only test nuclear weapons under the surface, down deep in the ground. France had not agreed with this, and they were continuing to detonate nuclear weapons in the South Pacific, far from Paris. But the French Polynesia, where Tahiti is, they were continuing to detonate hydrogen and atomic bombs in the atmosphere at this same time. But we went against the US tests. I mean, we're from Canada, so the US was right next to us, and they were one of the superpowers. France and England were second to United States and Russia, of course. And so we went against the US test, sailed a boat. And this boat, this little tiny boat on the Pacific Ocean, caused the media to pay attention. And pretty soon, tens of thousands of people were marching in the streets. And when this nuclear weapon was detonated, we didn't stop it, that one. When it was let off, 5 megaton hydrogen bomb, every border crossing between the United States and Canada was closed that day by people coming from north and south to join hands against nuclear weapons.
Wow.
So it was a turning point in many ways. Maybe it was just coincidental that we happened to be there exactly at this time. But at that time was the beginning of the reduction in nuclear weapons and the talks between Russia and the United States to de-escalate the tension over nuclear war. So the arms race, the Cold War, this was a cusp where it started to go down. But at this same time, was the emerging consciousness of the environment. Among the public, the media, and the politicians, people were beginning to realize that the rivers were dead in many parts of the world from toxics going in, and realize the threat of nuclear war, and realize that 30,000 whales were still being killed every year in the oceans for no real reason. We had lots of oil. You know, we don't need the oil from whales any longer. But Russia and Japan were still, with big fleets of factory boats and killer ships, were still going out in the ocean and killing 30,000 whales each year. And whales are large. The ocean doesn't have that many of them. You can count them in the thousands. So we sailed against this after we did the nuclear campaign. We spent 2 years against the atmospheric testing by France in French Polynesia. We sailed a boat from New Zealand 2 years in a row, 3,000 miles, a small sailboat. But this small sailboat had the same effect as our fishing boat. It made a focal point for attention. And we went to Paris and protested in the Notre Dame Cathedral, telling people about the boat that was going to stop the nuclear test. It took 2 years to stop this one. Oh, I forgot to mention, after we protested against the US hydrogen bomb, President Nixon at the time canceled the remaining plans for any more tests. That was the end of US hydrogen bomb testing right there. That's in great. Early 1972. So it only took a few months after we had made this protest and had all these people come to the border and all on TV, President Nixon said, that's enough. So he made a move to slow down the movement towards nuclear war. And then in 2 years, in 1972, 73, was the French campaign against atmospheric nuclear testing. New Zealand was kind of a focal point for opposition to the French nuclear tests because it's also in the Southern Hemisphere, and the radiation from these tests was going around the world and coming back to New Zealand with the Western flow from the other side of the Earth. And they could measure it, the fallout from these nuclear tests. So there was a big movement already against it. So we went to the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Environment, which was the first United Nations conference on the environment. Whereas most of the hippies and, you know, counterculture had their own alternative conference where they were with banners and color and costumes and whale balloons and things. We went to the real conference and we lobbied the Southern Hemisphere countries and other countries who were opposed to atmospheric nuclear testing. Now, Russia and United States and France and England had stated clearly going into this first environment conference that nuclear weapons were not part of the environment. So there would be no discussion of this. Only we would talk about pollution, air pollution, water pollution, etc. But they made it clear that they did not want a discussion of nuclear weapons. And these are the people who have the nuclear weapons and are continuing to test them and threaten the world with nuclear war. So we went into this conference after having spent quite a bit of time in New York at the United Nations headquarters, talking to the different countries around the Pacific and also in the Southern Hemisphere. So we'd already done some groundwork. And so we went into the conference and we asked somebody, please put a resolution on the table. They can't stop you from putting, any country can put a resolution. So New Zealand put a resolution on the table to end atmospheric nuclear testing in French Polynesia by France. And this passed with an overwhelming, of course, right? And really? That's what ended atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific, that vote, because the next year they went underground. They continued to test the nuclear weapons at Mururoa Atoll in French Polynesia for many years after that. But it was at least it was underground where the radiation wasn't spreading all around the world from the tests. And it wasn't until the mid-1990s, actually after I had left Greenpeace by some years, that finally nuclear testing ended altogether, except for North Korea.
Except for North Korea, yeah.
Today. And China continued for a little bit, but they don't do it anymore either. So that was possibly the most important thing Greenpeace did at a global historical level. But saving the whales actually was what made us famous.
Yes.
Because when we campaigned against nuclear testing by the United States and France, they said we must be communists because we weren't against Russia. You go against Russia, you're going to end up in the grave, right? So
Yes.
at that time, they would kill you. So it wasn't a very practical thing to do. I guess if we had some martyrs, but we weren't that kind of people. We weren't the kind of people who would rush in to be chopped in half as a martyr. You know,
it's not actually happened.
No, we were hippies. We were actually celebrating life. We didn't want to die. We were enjoying our life. And so we always said the revolution should be a celebration. And somehow the environmental movement has become less humorous as time has gone on. We actually had a lot of fun doing this, and we made a lot of jokes, and we had a lot of good times, and we mixed our celebration with our opposition to what was wrong in the world. And it's really interesting to see how we call them hair shirts. I don't know if you know that term. No. It's like you wear a shirt which is itchy, or you hit yourself with whips, you know, to suffer, and not have any fun at all because you're so serious to save the world or whatever. And this approach is the way the left is today. They have no humor whatsoever. And it is important to have humor, because if you don't see the lighter side of things, you're ending up being a jihad type person. Yeah. Like militant. It's just not the way to go, because all of a sudden you end up killing people, and it's not a good idea.
Is there something, you mentioned that you left Greenpeace, and the environmental movement, I think, was kind of went to another direction. What happened that you left Greenpeace?
Well, at the time I left Greenpeace, this is 15 years later, I had been in the top committee as a director. Even for 2 years, I was the leader of the original group in Canada. And then we became international, and I played a key role in helping to deal with the politics of bringing all these different countries of Greenpeace together, because there was a revolution by the US group to take our name and all our deeds away from us. And they said they would separate and become Greenpeace in the United States, we're Greenpeace in Canada. So there was a huge legal fight, which ended up being settled in an out-of-court settlement one day before our lawsuit against the Americans was to go to court for breach of copyright, because we said we own the name Greenpeace. We started this. It's our name. And that is how the settlement occurred to create Greenpeace International. The other groups had to agree that we owned the name. And in the negotiation that occurred in our lawyer's office in September of 1979, we reached an agreement to create a new legal entity called Greenpeace International that would include all the national organizations that had evolved, some simultaneously, some we had created on purpose, but it was a big mess politically. And that we brought that all back together in this meeting. And then Greenpeace International became the vehicle for Greenpeace with directors, and et cetera. And I was one of 5 international directors of Greenpeace from 1979 until I left voluntarily in 1986. So I'd been there for 15 years. And at this time, our main focus was toxics. The United States and Canada had passed quite good air and water pollution regulations, even when Greenpeace was beginning around then, 1972. But Europe had not done that. And of course, China and the rest of the world had not done that either. So we focused on the rivers of Europe, including England, the River Thames. They were all basically dead with no fish because factories were dumping toxic waste underwater into the rivers. So no one could see it. So we took a smaller boat. I think it was about 25 meters, a boat that could go up the rivers instead of in the sea. And we went up these rivers and with scuba divers went down and plugged the pipes. We found out where the pipes were, sending the poison into the rivers. We plugged the pipes and made the poison go back to the factory, into the flow on the floor of the factory. And this made media. We got in the news for this. And they stopped. And now the rivers of Europe have fish. So this could be seen not as important as stopping nuclear war, of course, but it was in many ways, and it wasn't my idea. This was the idea of the collective, of the group, over meeting regularly and figuring out what to do next. A lot of things were my idea, like stopping the capture of whales in the sea for aquariums. I led that expedition and campaign, but this one was really important, and we won because we did something unique. And whereas most people are just carrying a sign in the street saying stop this or stop that, the reason Greenpeace was so successful was we actually got up and did something.
Yeah.
Like we could go to sea in ships, and we could drive boats up rivers and scuba dive and plug up the pipes. So being able to actually do something real gets attention. And, and back to the humor, we had a fictitious place called the Giggle Room. To giggle is to ha 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 ha.
Yeah.
And when we made them look so bad for what they were doing in front of the media, we had this fictitious place called the Giggle Room, because you couldn't show this kind of derision or whatever you would call it in front of everybody. You had to go away and laugh about what you had just done, because it was so embarrassing to these people that they were basically shown to be killing the world with their poison from their factory.
Yeah. And
this worked very well. So why did I leave Greenpeace? Well, it's two-pronged, two issues. One high-level philosophical policy issue, and one very specific issue about a campaign. At the higher level, by this time, even though in the beginning, Greenpeace had a very strong humanitarian orientation to save civilization from nuclear war. So we cared about humans in the beginning. I mean, who doesn't? Well, Greenpeace didn't after a while. And as time went on and we focused on not so much human issues as purely environment, the whales and the baby seals and the toxics, and et cetera, where the humans were sort of portrayed as the bad guys, it was a natural evolution. Pretty soon, Greenpeace and much of the rest of the movement were stating publicly that humans are the enemies of the earth, that humans are the enemies of nature, like as if humans were the only bad species.
And we were
the other
nature.
Yeah, all the other 1.6 million species were good, and humans were evil. So to me, this was like, I grew up thinking about philosophy a lot, and my mother introduced me to the philosophers of England and US and Europe, the existentialists and the realists and the positivists, etc. So I understood philosophy, and and religion, and I'm going, this is just like too much like original sin.
Yeah.
Like humans are the only ones with evil. All the other species only have good, whatever insect or fish. And I knew this was wrong to cast, at a political level, to cast humans as the only evil species. And I rejected this and tried my best to explain to people at this philosophical level that that's just not the right way to talk to people and to move forward. Second, though, was at this same time, I found myself one of the international directors, but the only one with formal science education. All the other, just by chance, all the other international directors were either political activists, social activists, or just looking for a career in the environmental movement, because now you could actually make a living and pay your rent and have even a family, although without much money, but still enough to survive. In the beginning, we were all volunteers, where there was no money. So I found myself the only one with formal science education, and my fellow directors, and then they were focused on pollution at this time with the river campaign, and because chlorine is part of DDT, is part of dioxin, is a chlorinated hydrocarbon, which is a class of chemicals which contain chlorine.
All right.
They decided that chlorine was the common denominator in poison, and that therefore Greenpeace should begin a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. Now, they've tried to revision that too. They pretend today that was not a campaign, and because the internet wasn't even invented yet in the early 1980s, it's hard to go back and research it, but it's there in the newspapers from that time. Greenpeace adopted a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide, saying that all the women would get breast cancer if chlorine continued to be in the chemicals. And they forgot a couple of important things in this, and I tried to explain to them. First, that chlorine is one of the elements in the periodic table. It is one of the building blocks of the universe, like cobalt and magnesium and salt. No, I don't mean to say salt. I'm going to get to salt in a minute. But like iron and oxygen and carbon, it is one of the elements. So banning chlorine worldwide is actually just a political slogan. It's not something you could actually accomplish because it's there. It is actually the 11th most common element in the Earth's crust. But that was almost like a joke. The really important fact is that chlorine is the most important element for public health.
Yes.
Adding it to drinking water and swimming pools and spas prevents water-borne communicable diseases like cholera. And they were real big killers all through history. And chlorine has made our world with much less disease.
Much better.
Much better. And in addition to that, public health and medicine are two different things. In medicine, chlorine is 85% of the pharmaceuticals, the medicines, are made with chlorine chemistry, 85% of them. And 25% of our medicines actually have chlorine in them. But to come back to a simple example, table salt, sodium chloride, which is the main salt in the sea, and the sea is not killing the life because of sodium chloride.
There's a lot of life in the sea.
Yes, as a matter of fact, sodium chloride is an essential ingredient, essential nutrient. Without sodium chloride, life dies. It is essential for life. Up to a certain point, as with almost all chemicals, toxicology is a complex subject in science because something like table salt, which is an essential nutrient at low levels, a small amount, if you take it up and if you were to consume 5 tablespoons of sodium chloride, table salt, all at once, you would die. So it is also very toxic at higher levels. And this is true of virtually everything. Even water. You can have too much water and you drown.
Yeah.
That's not so much from toxicity as it is from asphyxiation. You have so much water in you, you can't get the oxygen to your lungs, like you're drowning, in other words.
Yes.
But this is true of generally of chemicals. And vitamin A, for example, beta carotene in plants, animals use that to make vitamin A. You can get too much vitamin A and it becomes toxic to you at a certain level. So I had to leave. The thing about humans are the enemies of the earth was sort of a philosophical point. You could argue it into the deep night if you wished.
It can take you to
But
dark.
for me, there was no argument about chlorine. Chlorine was a very essential element for public health and medicine. And if you think it should be banned, then that reinforces the idea that you think people are evil. Because if we ban chlorine, the Black Death will come back. You know?
Yes.
I mean, worse than COVID.
And like, everything else.
I think 1/3 of the human population died at that time. So there is my story of why I left Greenpeace and why I helped start Greenpeace. And but I've had 35 plus years since then to do what I've been doing.
Yeah, there is another project. You mentioned vitamin A, and there is a story in your book about golden rice and that project that you helped set up. Can you tell us about why vitamin A is the lack of vitamin A is bad for us? Why do people need? And what happened to that project? Why did you set that up?
Well, first off, vitamin A is synthesized in our bodies from plants, and plants contain beta carotene. Beta carotene is a compound which is in all green plants. So any plant you see which is green, there is beta carotene in that green part of the plant. But beta carotene isn't green. The reason it is yellow or orange. That is why carrots are orange, and that is why the name beta carotene was used, because of carrots. Carrots have a lot of beta carotene in them, and that is why carrots are associated with eyesight, because beta carotene and vitamin A that we make from beta carotene in our bodies, all animals do, that is why we can see, because we have vitamin A. But not only that, it was discovered not until in the 1980s that vitamin A, which we make from the plant's beta carotene, is also essential for the immune system. And this is a bigger thing in some ways than eyesight, because the immune system is to do with all diseases which are trying to attack you. So the eyesight thing is a very specific aspect, whereas the immune system is a much broader concept than just eyesight. And so it was then discovered that lack of beta carotene and therefore lack of vitamin A is the biggest killer of children and the biggest cause of blindness in the world by far. The last statistics on this were that somewhere between 1 and 2 million children, almost all people who are poor in tropical countries where rice is the staple. And the reason is 1 and 2 million children die from vitamin A deficiency each year because rice has no beta carotene, 0. Whereas corn, which is a staple food for many people, you notice it's yellow. That is beta carotene, making it yellow. Carrots, of course, beta carotene making them orange. Yams and sweet potatoes in particular, are orange. They have beta carotene. Potatoes have a little yellow under the skin. That is beta carotene. So all the other staple foods, which are used for energy, the starch, of our diet and the sugar have some beta carotene. Rice does not. And the poorest of the poor in the tropical countries use rice as their staple food. Some billions of people use rice as their main food.
Yes.
And so the poorest of the poor only get a cup of rice each day, and as a result are not getting beta carotene in their diet. And the typical situation is, first they go blind, about 500,000 each year, and then they die from vitamin A deficiency, or else they die before they go blind. And so this has been known for a long time. UNICEF and UNESCO and these organizations are well aware of it. Most people who understand nutrition or study nutrition are aware of it. So in the early 1990s, two European scientists, Dr. Ingo Potricus in Switzerland, and the other scientist is German. They're both speaking German as their main language, decided to work together to find a solution to this, to try to figure out how to make a rice plant that has beta carotene in the grain of rice. The leaves of rice are full of beta carotene, but we don't eat the leaves of rice. We only eat the grain. So how do we get beta carotene into the grain of rice? And they worked for some years trying to figure out how to breed rice with each other to make a variety which contains beta carotene, and they failed in this. And this just happened to coincide with Monsanto's development of genetic modification, as it's called, transgenic science, where you take a gene from one species and put it into another to confer a desirable trait in that other species. And of course, it became Frankenstein and Frankenfood and all these things, as if people were purposefully doing evil things rather than what they were really doing, which was trying to improve the varieties of food crops to have more vitamins or to be resistant to insects and all these things.
Use less pesticides?
Yes, all kinds of, yes, many, many things. But this all gets twisted in the media, of course, right from the beginning. And so now you have people marching by the thousands in the streets against the evil Monsanto, right? They're not making nuclear weapons. They are not terrorists. They are a seed company, in fact. That's what Monsanto is. Now they're owned by Bayer, which is also a seed company. But most people associate Bayer with either medicine or chemicals, but they are also a seed company. And seeds are what we need to grow our food. Without seeds, it's difficult to grow food. And of course, animals, they depend on seeds too.
Yeah.
And I often say to people, we should think like a plant, because that is how we are existing. The only way all animals exist is by plants. So don't just think of what people need, think of what plants need, because if they were not here, neither would we be here. And so that's a bit of an aside, but it's a philosophical point that people should understand. And so these two German scientists, Ingo Potricus and his partner, decided to use genetic modification to see if they could get beta carotene into the rice, and they succeeded in 1999. They succeeded, and it was the cover of Time magazine, showed Ingo Potricus with a rice plant saying this rice could save 1 million children. But underneath was, activists say this should not be allowed, or some heading like this. We should not be allowed to save 1 million children, apparently. And that began the campaign against golden rice. Now, the reason the campaign against golden rice was so intense and so important to these, whatever you want to call them, anti-human people, right? The reason it was so important, because the last thing they want is a humanitarian success story based on GMO, because that means there's a good GMO, like a really good one.
They were willing to kill million children a year to fight against GMO.
And they still are.
They still
today.
are.
They still are today, yes. Even though they are weaker, now we still don't have golden rice in production. Now, golden rice is the name that was given to the GMO created rice, because the rice is yellow, because it has beta carotene, because otherwise rice is white, it's just starch. And the little bit of beta carotene, in the same way that carrots and corn show the color of beta carotene, because in a green leaf, the chlorophyll, which is green, is hiding the color of the beta carotene. But in a grain of, there's no chlorophyll in a corn kernel or in a potato or in a carrot, because it's a vegetative underground part. Why there would be no chlorophyll there? Chlorophyll is for the sunshine, to make sugar. And so this is a golden rice. And it seemed like such a perfectly wonderful thing that would be capable of saving all these children.
Isn't it being produced yet?
It's produced only in research so far. Now, last year, more than 1 year ago now, maybe almost 2, the Philippines, which is where the International Rice Research Institute is and where most of this work has been done, supported by many humanitarian organizations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Helen Keller organization, which is responsible for the blind. And lack of vitamin A is by far the biggest cause of blindness in humans. Not the other, you have to get your eye poked out with a stick or something otherwise. There are not many diseases which cause blindness, and vitamin A deficiency is by far the main one. So the people who are concerned with the blind are working very closely with the Golden Rice campaign, the Golden Rice Project. But in 2013, now already 13 years after golden rice has been invented and still has not been delivered, the International Rice Research Institute was doing field trials of different strains of golden rice to see which ones would work in, because rice has many varieties depending on what country you're in and what climate you're in, etc., like many food crops do, many different genetic varieties, not anything that you would do with GMO, but just breeding of plants. And so the field trials of rice were going on, and I was sitting at my kitchen table at my country home in Winter Harbor with my wife Eileen and my late brother Michael, who when he was alive, worked with me all the time. We were like partners in business, partners in life. And so we were 3 of us around the table, and I opened my laptop to read an Associated Press media release coming right now saying that Filipino farmers have invaded the International Rice Research Institute and destroyed the field trials of golden rice by pulling all the rice plants from the ground. Filipino farmers have done this, it said. I knew right away this was a lie. And in truth, Greenpeace in Philippines had used buses to bring urban radicals, all covered in tattoos and pink hair and whatever in the pictures we saw later, brought them in to the International Rice Research Institute, and they destroyed the rice field. But they had also brought a bunch of farmers who looked on horrified to watch this happen. They were standing on the side. And so they could say, Greenpeace could say, there's Filipino farmers here. And that story went worldwide, and it took a long time to prove that it was Greenpeace that did that, and it came out in the media eventually, but everybody thought that it was farmers. Farmers don't go into a science project on a new strain of food and rip them out That's not what farmers plant things. They don't destroy them. And they're used to growing
We had
things.
something here in Brazil, I think about 10 years ago or more. A French activist came with buses with people. They destroy an eucalyptus research in the south of Brazil also. It's not uncommon here also, unfortunately.
Well, yes, and this is just plain ignorance, which drives these things. Ignorance and political power and influence, and trying to get attention on doing something backwards, not in the interest of humanity whatsoever. And so even today, golden rice is not being grown for people. It's only still in research. And there's no other way. They try to use pills with vitamin A pills. These people live in slums. They live in remote country places out in the middle of nowhere. That's not going to be the solution, because pills cost money. It doesn't cost any money extra for the rice to be delivered to them with the beta carotene in. But in the final analysis, this is about the anti-GMO movement.
Yeah,
which
should we be afraid of those seeds?
We should be ashamed that we have not. And we were the first one. I came back to the kitchen table when we read this media release. I said, that's it. Because up till then, I had been speaking at every one of my speaking engagements. I gave a piece of my speech to the golden rice story. For 13 years, I had been doing that. But I had not become an activist again yet. At that kitchen table, I said, okay, we create a campaign, because hundreds of groups were campaigning against GMOs. This had become a big deal for everybody, thinking how great they were to stop this evil genetic thing from happening, when in fact it could cure so many people. And so we said, we're going to make a campaign. And we did for 3 years. We campaigned all through the European countries and all through South Asia. It was a big deal. We raised maybe $250,000 compared to Greenpeace with their 300 million per year. But we went and protested in front of the Greenpeace offices all over Europe and got the media to come out, and then held a media conference and explained the story. So we managed to reach maybe 50 million people in Europe and Asia. In Europe, where the campaign was centered, in the richest countries in the world, campaigning to stop the poorest people in the world from getting health and living and not being blind, from these big Greenpeace offices in Hamburg, which is where the most money is in Greenpeace. It was quite something else. Of course, the Greenpeace people stayed behind the doors. They would not come out and talk. That's the way it is with Greenpeace today. When we were Greenpeace, we were out talking all the time. We were public, and people could come into the office of Greenpeace. Anybody could come in. Sometimes we had to, say, sorry, we don't want you here, because it'd be some homeless person looking for some food.
Yeah.
And that wasn't our job. But we would certainly let them sit in a corner somewhere for a while. And so you end up, when you have a totally open office, you end up with a lot of people coming in, not because you are Greenpeace, but because you have an office where you can go in and get out of the rain. And interesting times. But today, Greenpeace does not allow the public into their office. You have to have an appointment to get in their office. And today, they are behind closed doors. They are part of the whole Davos community. They are part of the International Economic Forum, or whatever it's called. They're part of the United Nations apparatus, which is basically trying to take control of the world. So I have a belief that if they did, we would be ruled by bureaucrats from Beijing. This would be the global model of governance. And it strikes me that is not the right way to go. But that's another subject.
I saw the organization that I had helped to create turn into kind of a negative force.